Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving right into a fascinating historical detective story. We're talking about using modern genetics to solve an ancient, deeply buried mystery. You know, the Sumerians. They were the architects of one of the world's very first civilizations. But despite leaving behind incredible cities, writing systems, and groundbreaking technologies, a massive question mark has always hovered right over their origins. Like, where exactly did they come from? Well, to find out, researchers essentially had to turn human DNA into a literal time machine.
So it really boils down to a question of survival and legacy. Are the descendants of the world's first civilization still living right now, today, in the marshes of Iraq? I know, it sounds straight out of an adventure movie, but this is a serious scientific inquiry. For decades, archaeologists and historians have wondered, did the ancient Sumerian bloodline just vanish into the sands of time? Or did it actually survive, hidden away in a very specific, isolated environment? Let's take a look. Nestled right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in southern Iraq, we find the Mesopotamian marshes. This lush, wetland delta was historically known as the Biblical Garden of Eden, and it was actually the birthplace of urban civilization over 5,000 years ago. The ancient Sumerians built grand, legendary cities like Uruk, and Eridu right on the edges of these very waters. Now, what makes this region so incredibly special today are the modern inhabitants known as the Marsh Arabs, or the Madan. They live this village lifestyle that perfectly mirrors archaeological findings from the Sumerian era. Seriously, it's a way of life that has remained virtually unchanged for 7 millennia, 7,000 years. They build these highly specific, beautiful arched reed homes. They graze water buffaloes, spear fish, and they navigate the waters in these slender wooden boats covered in bitumen called taradas. The cultural parallels here are just staggering, and it really hints at a deep, unbroken historical connection to the ancient Sumerians. But of course, this brings us to the core conflict of our explainer. Because despite these amazing cultural similarities, the origins of the Marsh Arabs, and by extension the Sumerians, are heavily debated. On one side, we have the foreign ancestry hypothesis. This is actually based on popular local folklore, and it suggests they're foreigners who arrived much later from the Indian subcontinent, bringing the whole practice of rearing water buffaloes with them. Competing right against this is the autochthonous hypothesis. Autochthonous is just a fancy scientific word for indigenous or native. This theory argues that no, they are the direct indigenous descendants of the ancient Sumerians, rooted right there in the Middle East from the very beginning.
Part 1. DNA as a time machine. Investigating the genetic clues.
So to really settle this debate, historical records and archaeological digs just weren't cutting it. Geneticists had to look inside the people themselves. And the crucial key to unlocking this DNA time machine is something called a haplogroup. Think of haplogroups as microscopic genetic footprints left behind by our ancient ancestors. Because they're passed down strictly from father to son via the Y chromosome, or from mother to child via mitochondrial DNA, they don't get all scrambled up over generations. They act as a direct line, allowing scientists to trace unbroken lineages back thousands of years and map out ancient human migrations. Any good scientific investigation needs a solid methodology, right? So the research team traveled to the Al-Hoyza marshes. This is the last remaining undrained marsh area in southern Iraq. Now, it's incredibly rare to find human populations that have stayed completely isolated in one exact spot for dozens of generations. But the researchers carefully gathered DNA samples from 143 Marsh Arab males who could trace their local ancestry back at least 4 generations. Then, to know if their genetics were truly unique, they collected samples from a control group of 154 general Iraqi subjects living along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. After that, it was time to cross-compare the variations.
Part 2. Reading the genetic clues. What the Y chromosome reveals.
Okay, let's start with the paternal line. By isolating the male-specific Y chromosome, researchers uncovered a massive clue that basically blew that foreign ancestry hypothesis wide open. A staggering 72.7% of the Marsh Arab men belong to a single Y chromosome lineage called J1 page 08. Now compare that to just 26.6% in the general Iraqi control group. Haplogroup J1 is a deeply indigenous, heavily Middle Eastern lineage. Seeing it at over 70% in one single population, that is an incredibly high frequency. It completely dwarfs the control group and proves an intense, long-standing local isolation. There is almost zero trace of the paternal lineages you'd expect to see if they had actually migrated from India or South Asia.
But genetics don't just tell us where, they tell us when. Take a look at this central, densely packed, star-like shape in the median joining network. In the world of genetics, this kind of star-like cluster is the ultimate telltale signature of a rapid, historical population expansion. And here is the craziest part. When researchers date this specific expansion, it aligns almost perfectly with the period of the Sumerian city-states. It's literally the genetic echo of a civilization suddenly booming in the Delta thousands of years ago. How cool is that?
Geographically mapping this data really leaves no room for doubt. Both the family trees and the regional mapping show the Marsh Arabs clustering squarely within an indigenous Middle Eastern landscape. They're grouped tightly with other Arab and Middle Eastern populations, positioned completely distinctly and separately from Indian or South Asian groups. So, that paternal foreign origin theory, it simply collapses under the weight of the DNA evidence.
But hey, what about the mothers? Sometimes in history, foreign men arrive, or vice versa, and it changes half the genetic picture. However, the maternal DNA, or mTA-DNA, tells the exact same story. It points firmly to local roots, revealing a heavily prevalent West Eurasian and Middle Eastern component. Now, to be fair, they did find some very weak South Asian contributions, but that actually makes perfect sense. The introduction of water buffalo breeding and rice farming from the East clearly happened through some trade or minor contact, but it only marginally affected the indigenous gene pool. The people themselves absolutely did not mass migrate from the East.
Part 3, the final verdict. Closing the cold case. So, all the pieces of the puzzle are finally on the table. We have the cultural evidence of a 7,000-year-old lifestyle, we have the paternal Y chromosomes shouting Middle Eastern origins, and we have the maternal DNA backing it all up. The study's final verdict is pretty powerful. They conclude that a prevalent Middle Eastern ancestry implies that if the Marsh Arabs are descendants of the ancient Sumerians, then the Sumerians themselves were also most likely autochthonous, meaning native and not of Indian or South Asian ancestry. In short, the Marsh Arabs are indigenous. They have been there all along. And if their uninterrupted culture is truly the echo of Sumer, it proves the legendary Sumerians were fundamentally local to the Middle East. They didn't arrive from some distant land to build their great cities. They rose up right from the very soil and marshes of Mesopotamia.
It is absolutely mind-blowing, isn't it? Just thinking about how a microscopic swab of DNA can literally solve a 5,000-year-old archaeological debate, connecting a modern group of marsh dwellers directly to the dawn of human civilization. As we wrap up this explainer and reflect on how our DNA acts as this incredible, living library of human history, it leaves us with one final provocative question. What ancient mysteries, what lost civilizations or forgotten migrations do you think are locked away right now inside your very own genetic code? Thanks for exploring this historical detective story with me.